why are Irish energy bills so high? A new report from the International Energy Agency has found that retail prices in Ireland are 3 times higher than wholesale prices. This means we have some of the highest electricity prices in Europe, and as winter approaches, more than 1 million households face further price hikes this month. Joining me to discuss this are Fianna Fáil TD Naoise Ó Cearúil, Labour TD Conor Sheahan, Darragh Cassidy of bonkers.ie and Liz Carolan, the tech and democracy journalist. You can send us your comments. Simply scan the QR code or contact us via the WhatsApp number below. There'll be lots of people watching this, Naoise, who feel like the energy companies are taking them for a ride. Is that true?
I don't think it's true. I do think we've all seen an increase in our energy bills. However, what the government are trying to do is take a strategic look at energy in this country. And previously we had one-off measures. What we've seen in this recent budget was a reduction of VAT from 13.5% to 9%, and also 3.5 billion invested in the grid, and that'll be 16 billion over the lifetime of this government. So that's 5 years. So what we're trying to do is look at it from a strategic point of view, trying to establish essentially, how can we manage this sustainably over the long term, rather than relying on one-off measures as we have done in previous years.
So management over the long term, is not to be derided, but people who are facing higher energy bills in the short term will wonder what use is that for them. And
there is fuel allowance increase of €5, which will help 410,000 individuals over the coming months. But what we have to be, and we get criticised a lot of the time for not being strategic. If you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a day. And we're seeing that with the one-off measures. Whereas if we teach a man to fish, and what I'm saying by this is essentially investing in the grid, we can ensure that there's energy sustainability and efficiency over the long term, rather than just from a year-to-year basis.
Conor, have you faith that the government have a strategic plan in the long term?
No, I don't, Kieran, because if you look at what the government are doing in terms of energy policy, like they're baking in our dependency on fossil fuels even further by building an LNG terminal. We know that the price of electricity is linked to the price of wholesale gas, and by building an LNG terminal, we are going to further entrench the dependence that we have on fossil fuels. We believe, we need to look at issues such as, for example, data centres. I'm not ideologically against data centres at all, but there is a correlation in other jurisdictions between higher electricity prices and a higher proportion of data centres. And we've seen them explode in recent years, and I believe, and the Labour Party believes, that we need to hit pause, as the Secretary-General of the Department of Climate said in May of last year, until we actually figure out how to get these data centres to generate their own renewable energy.
Yeah, we might come back to the issue of data centres, because they do use a huge amount of electricity on the grid. But why the introduction of LNG into the system?
Well, we have to ensure that we have energy security in this country. We are an island nation at the end of the day, and we rely on importing most of our energy. And so we have to look at multifaceted. For example, if there was damage done to any of the gas imports in this country, we'd be in serious problems. So we have to diversify our energy demands in this country, and LNG is one part of that. It's not the whole part of it, but it's one part of it.
Conor, you're shaking your head. No backup plan?
I don't agree with that at all, because, if you look at, for example, the wholesale price of gas and how dependent we are, for example, on Russian gas, by baking in LNG infrastructure, we're going to make ourselves further dependent on on fossil fuels from,
But it's a version of a rainy day fund when it comes to energy supply. So what's the Labour equivalent of it?
Well, I'll give you an example. We still haven't done the DMAP's marine mapping in terms of the Shannon estuary. The Estuary Task Force report has been published well over a year. If you listen to the chair of the task force, Barry O'Sullivan, he'll tell you that they want to see delivery on the recommendations of the task force report, and that needs to be accelerated and prioritised by government.
And what are those recommendations, and how would that implementing those recommendations provide, again, a backup, a version of a rainy day fund when it comes to energy supplies?
Well, it would help us, for example, transition off of fossil fuels to transition to renewable offshore energy. We need to de-risk wind energy. For example, these should be priorities for government.
No, but in the short term, nobody around the table, is operating under the illusion that we're going to be able to switch to renewables in the foreseeable future. That's a long-term plan.
But it's going to take at least 5 years to put in place this LNG infrastructure. We know we have emission reduction targets. It's simply, if you look at the attitude of the previous government and the previous minister...
But what about the 30 years after that, where we're still going to be using some amount of fossil fuels? What's your backup?
But the fact of the matter is, what we need to do, for example, and I said this, is hit pause, first of all, on data centres, because we know that data centres, for example, a lot of them rely on fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to transition the country away from dirty LNG. That is my position, and that's the position of the Labour Party. We need to move towards renewable energy at an accelerated speed and pace.
Darragh, in terms of this report today that we got from this International Energy Association, why are we paying so much higher in retail prices compared to other countries around the world, other countries in Europe?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons. Some of these are unique to Ireland, some of them aren't, but unfortunately none of them are going to be resolved within the next day or within the next week, so we need to be honest about that. A big issue we have with high prices here is that we still use gas to generate a lot of our electricity. Obviously the price of gas has increased hugely over the past few years. I would say to people though, often we hear politicians say, well, the response to that is to bring more renewables onto the system to replace the gas. Renewable energy isn't particularly cheap. In fact, the prices we're paying a lot of wind operators at the moment are pretty much close to the prices that we're actually paying some gas generating plants. So wind is cleaner, solar is cleaner, it's greener, it's great, but it's not necessarily going to bring us drastically lower prices.
Sorry, I know, because I want to get to what is driving up the price, some of those factors unique to Ireland, but is the argument in favour of the transition to renewables less now about finances and more about just energy independence and the clean nature of how the energy is generated? Yeah,
I would agree, because I think people are beginning to find out a little bit more about the costs and they're beginning to kind of educate themselves. And as I said, the benefits, I think, of renewable energy and green energy won't be necessarily seen on our bills. It'll be seen in the fact that we'll have cleaner air, cleaner energy, we'll have hopefully lots more jobs, a green economy in Ireland, and those are all really, really admirable things and great things. But I would say to anybody who is watching and to the government, I really think there is this belief that green energy and wind and solar is going to bring drastically lower electricity prices over the next 5 to 10 years, and that simply isn't going to be the case.
So to come back then to the prices that we pay, the retail prices here, I mean, we can't be the only country in the world that's not big on energy generation and who has their electricity prices linked to gas.
No, we're not. In fact, pretty much every country in Europe uses
and then
marginal
why is
pricing.
Our price so much higher then?
So as I said, well, there is the gas issue. The second is that we have a weakly connected grid. So in some ways, it's great that we produce a lot of our own electricity. It gives us some security, although, mind you, a lot of it is because we import it. So I agree that we need an LNG plant, absolutely. But we don't have a lot of connectors with other countries. So we can't import cheaper electricity from other countries quickly and easily. We do have a new interconnector that we're building with France, which will allow us to tap into cheaper French nuclear in the next 2 or 3 years. So that is good. Another issue is we have a dispersed population. So we have lots of one-off houses. So the cost for the transport of electricity throughout Ireland is really, really high. And it's much higher in other countries. So, I mean, we have electricity grids and infrastructure going down tiny little laneways throughout the country that you just don't see in other countries. And actually, the size of our grid is around 3 times the size of the UK grid on a per capita basis. So that leads to increased prices as well. We've no nuclear. We only have a tiny amount of hydro. Other countries which use those tend to have cheaper energy. Nuclear is a debate for a different day. We could be here all day talking about that. Our hydro options, just given the geography of the country, are really, really limited. And quickly, we tend to have smaller, more inefficient generators. So we really need to invest in new generators, more efficient generators, scale up. And then quickly as well, just potentially around the hedging of suppliers as well. I think we've quite a poor hedging market, that this is where suppliers buy electricity in advance. Maybe that's something that the energy regulator and the government could look at. So that's maybe more of a shorter, quicker solution.
So the people today, on foot of this story, and I think Charlie Weston had it first before anybody else, the front page of The Independent, who suggest that this is energy companies gouging us and they're enjoying huge profits off the back of kind of hard-pressed Irish households.
When you look at the profits that are being made, I don't think they're necessarily supernormal profits, to be honest. Just very, very quickly, when you start adding up all the different fees and charges, and some of these won't be known by households and people who are watching, but when you start adding up the fees and charges, they kind of get quite close to 30 to 35 cents, which is what we're told we're paying quite quickly. So there's the wholesale cost, so that's about 10 cents. There's the grid fees, that I discussed for the transport of electricity throughout the country, they add on around another 4 or 5 cents. They're high in Ireland, as I said, because we have a dispersed population. You also then have to add on VAT. The government takes about 9%, 10%. You add on then the supplier charges of around another 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And then also, like getting too technical, because I don't want all of your viewers to be switching off, we have to pay what's called balancing charges and capacity market charges as well.
They're too depressed to switch off, I think, Darragh.
They
wanted to hear that there was gouging going on and somebody could do something about it.
But they add then, right, around another 4 cents to the bill, OK, so it's per kilowatt hour. And they're largely as a result of all the wind and the variable energy that we have on the system and the fact that we have quite a small weekly connected grid. So basically, add up all of that, you're getting to around 25 or 26 cents.
Yeah. Liz, when you take all of that into account and then you look at the grid and the amount of infrastructural work that has to happen with the national grid over the coming years, you look at the pace of the renewable revolution, if we'll call it that, kind of change dropping slowly in that regard. This is going to get worse, possibly, before it gets better, if it ever does.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to live in a changed climate and to cope with climate change, we are going to have to electrify so much more of our energy system, which means, we're going from putting petrol into our cars to plugging our cars in at night. Like all of these different types of changes. But I mean, the kind of elephant in the room around, it was mentioned briefly there, around energy, around electricity in particular, is, AI is, what appears as data centers and infrastructure, but is really AI. And, I was even reflecting today, we're going to go from so many services being, based on our interactions with humans or things happening, to them being data centers whirling and, being our therapists, being all these sorts of things that AI is promising that it will be. And if we look at, say OpenAI, right, who they own ChatGPT, they have their new image, video generation kind of software. Just in the last couple of months, they have signed deals that would mean them needing and buying the equivalent of, I think, about 20 million households worth of energy in an ongoing basis just around their data centers. And that's a fraction of what they think they need just to be dealing with our ChatGPT prompts and to be generating these kind of slop videos. The amount of demand that we're going to have on kind of that side of the ledger, at the same time as, we can't forget that, climate change also has an impact on our renewable energy infrastructure. When we have storms, there was a wind turbine blew over, right, in the last storm that we had. There's always damage that's being done. And then we have the instability. Brussels was telling everybody in Europe this summer that we need to be prepared for 72 hours of no electricity, no water and no food. As a bloc, our emergency preparedness given our neighbours to the east means that we need to be getting to the point whereby we have some of that energy independence, probably at a household level. So
you've got the entire economy having to become electrified to a degree. You've got data centres, which at the moment I think is about 22% in maybe any given day of electricity in the grid. That might increase. Certainly if there's a proliferation of data centres in this country, it will. There will be a proliferation somewhere in the world on foot of this AI revolution.
We'll probably be here.
They have to happen somewhere. And
how do we manage it?
Well, and I can feel the pressure on the government at the moment to be liberalising around, the growth of data centres. The companies who rely on these will tell the government whatever they need to tell them in order to get approvals to get this kind of infrastructure built. And we're being promised an AI revolution, and we're being promised everything else. But the demand is limitless, right? The demand that AI companies have in particular for energy and for these resources is absolutely limitless. And I think as a country, we need to be thinking, well, what is our strategy? What is our approach? How does this impact our long-term kind of economic profile? And when are we going to kind of stand up and say enough is enough?
I do think we do need to take stock maybe with data centres. And look, I know the importance of data centres for our day-to-day lives. I think most people do. But as you said, around 25% of the country's entire electricity is used by data centres. The EU average is around 3%. So yes, we might feel we're losing investment to some of these countries. That's because they can handle it. But mind you, in Britain, they're trying to obviously increase investment in data centres. I think they're already beginning to complain, and they haven't even built some of the data centres. So there's no country in the world that comes close to having 25% of their grid being consumed by data centres. So I think we do need to pause for a while.
Naoise, do we need to pause?
Well, I think we need to look at this in a round and how vital data centres are to our day-to-day lives. People watching television at home on their phones or on their TVs, a lot of that information is going through data centres. Let's be real about it. But then there's the large users.
But they don't need to be in Ireland.
Well, but they need to be somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of data, we can't just export our problems and our data to other countries. But what I will say is the CRU completed...
But you're not, except just like on pure mathematics, the situation is unsustainable at the moment. That if 25% of the energy that we are generating or that is in the grid is being used by data centres at the moment, that we can't continue to allow them to be built.
So data centres are a core part of our economy at the moment, and there's no denying that. But what the government is looking at now, what Minister Darragh O'Brien has been reviewing, is the private wires legislation. So we're hoping that will come before the Dáil in the next 6 to 12 months, roughly.
Explain what that is for people.
So the private wires is essentially, if you have a data centre, the data centre could create energy on site. So they could have a solar farm, they could have a wind farm, for example, that essentially allows them to create their own energy rather than tapping into the national grid. So that would take a lot of the stress off the national grid. It would also get rid of a lot of the arguments around 25% of energy being used by data centres, and it would allow us to, particularly those companies that are investing here in data centres, to actually create those solar farms and also those wind farms. And just to finish, they could also sell that energy back to the grid as well, which would hopefully make energy cheaper at the same time.
We have a finite capacity to build wind and solar infrastructure, both in terms of having the skills to build it, in terms of people's tolerance for having this kind of infrastructure near them. What I hear when I hear that is we're going to privatise and hive off a part of our energy generating infrastructure for one industry. Right? And we're going to perhaps maybe allow them at some point to sell that back to us.
The private wires covers a lot more than that. So one issue that people at home with electric vehicles will experience, particularly those living in terraced houses, for example, that they can't actually get a wire to their car. The private wires would allow those households actually charge their car, go under the actual public footpath. So the private wires, while yes, it's covering the larger infrastructural piece.
No, but I think, sorry, not about wires, Elizabeth, but I think the issue there was that there's finite resources in terms of, we'll say, the construction wherewithal in that industry to build all of this. And if you're going to say, right, we're going to now allow these data centres to be built all around the country as long as they cover the roof in solar panels or buy a few acres next door and cover the field in solar panels, then that's fewer people to put solar panels on public buildings or for public use or on people's private homes or to retrofit homes up and down the country.
I did disagree with that. I did disagree with that completely. There's international resources here, not just the resources in Ireland. And what's important here as well, I think we should be careful with the language, that will be data centres all over the country. We have local authorities, we have a commission plan that look at every planning application in the whole and actually make a decision on it. It's not as if there's going to be a plethora.
But when you say you reject that, I mean, what element of it do you reject? Do you reject the argument that there's finite resources in the construction industry when it comes to retrofitting homes or installing solar panels? You reject that? But
we have solar panels coming out from China, hundreds of thousands of solar panels. They're easy to access now. They're a lot cheaper. I look at Timahoe North Solar Farm in my own constituency that was opened by Minister Darragh O'Brien only last month, the largest solar farm in the country.
But demand is still outstripping supply in terms of solar panels. I mean, you're saying that you want to put all the solar panels that we can get in the roofs of data centres.
We're talking wind as well. It's not just solar panels. There's a mix here.
We don't just, go online, order some solar panels from China and suddenly have infrastructure. We don't, because those solar panels you need to get planning permission for the land. Right, you need to connect that to the grid.
You don't need planning to put solar panels on top of your roof.
But you also need backup supply. You need backup supply. The more data centres are using, and yes, one day or 1 week they could be using 90% renewable energy, but then there could be a day or a week where they're actually using 90% fossil fuels. So you always need to remember, you can talk about all this renewable energy that's going to be brought onto the system to generate and support the data centres, which we're going to have battery storage and also potentially fossil fuel generators as backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine.
And Darragh is correct there, in fairness, and that's why there's been pushback, in fairness, from the ESB and EirGrid around the private wires. Yeah. And that's why it's taking longer to actually come to fruition.
I think we should be very, very careful in relation to data centres. I mean, if you've seen the explosion of AI in recent years, it all reminds me a bit of the .com bubble, and we could be looking at a crash here at some point, and we could have invested very heavily in data centres, some of whom will need fossil fuel gas generation, and we could end up with a lot of very expensive and redundant infrastructure. If you look at the moment, data centres use 50% of the electricity
if there's an
Dublin.
AI bubble and an AI crash, much like the .com, you're not going to have redundant data centres.
Well, the fact...
What happened there, Conor, was that, I mean, hedge funds and investors lost money by punting on the wrong e-commerce company. It wasn't the end of e-commerce. They just punted on the wrong company.
Wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of the internet. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is you're talking here about investing a significant amount of the state's finite resources in something that for the vast majority of people delivers little in the way of a material benefit. We have 50% of the electricity capacity at the moment in Dublin and Meath is used by data centres. It's crazy. I'm not against them, but we need to pause until we... For example, data centres should have to publish a decarbonisation plan. We also should do an audit of all large energy users to find out, for example, what their requirements are and how they can contribute back to the grid.
Another point which I think gets lost when we talk about data centres, when other businesses look to do business here, so non-data centres, so manufacturing or any other type of company, two of the things they look at is the cost of energy and also the stability of the electricity grid. And of course, they want to make sure that there's a favourable tax system, that we can speak English, etc. But I think that gets lost, that a business won't come to Ireland if they feel that energy prices are too high and the grid is at risk of blackouts or being unstable. And the number of data centres we have at the moment is potentially going to put that at risk. So there is kind of a fear that in order to accommodate these data centres and maybe promote a tiny bit of the economy and create a few jobs, you're actually putting loads of other jobs and other industries at risk.
Yeah.
How much is too much electricity for data centres to be using from the national grid? If 25% isn't too much, how much is too much?
No, I think there's a point. There's a valid point that a quarter of all energy is being used by data centres.
It's going to go to 30%
excuse me.
in 5 years.
Of course, it's a valid point. Do I have a number for you, an ideal number? No, I don't. But that's why I do feel like, and I believe
50%.
But I do. No, that's far too high. I think
somewhere between. You don't have a number, but it's somewhere between 25 and 50.
I'd say somewhere between 25 and 40% at a maximum. But what I will say is this: I do believe thoroughly that the private wires legislation is crucial, so that it'll reduce the demands of the large energy users. And we're not just talking about data centres here, we're talking about the large manufacturers as well.
And again, just to reiterate, and I don't want to completely labour this point, but the argument that the economy has a capacity to deliver X amount of solar energy infrastructure, diverting that to data centre or to data centres, you just reject that logic, is it?
Well, what I'm saying is that
you think the economy will still be able to produce X amount of solar panel energy infrastructure, and additional to that.
Well, what we have to ensure is that there is.
So
the CRU have just completed a report on the data being used by large energy users, and the feedback has been, I suppose, gone through at the moment, and a report is going to go to government. It's on the government and on the minister at that stage to actually review the document, review the feedback, and actually come up with a proposal around it.
Anyway, that's not what I asked. I asked about just that idea that there's capacity. The point that Liz raised initially, that there's a finite capacity for us to build this infrastructure. And if we are going to allow the data centres to build it for their own energy generation, it means other people can't.
Let me be unambiguous. The priority for anybody should be that households have the energy that they need. After that, it should be industry. And that's being completely unambiguous.